Going to begin with the first panel on U.S. China Strategic Rivalry in the Biden era. I'm going to just mention the current titles of the four panelists. Their biographies are in the online pamphlet you have access to, and you can read them there in detail. A very talented group. Michael SWAINE, the director of the East Asia program, Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Huang Jing, dean of professor of and director of the Institute of U.S. Pacific Studies at Shanghai University, and then Dennis Wilder, who is beside me here, senior fellow, Initiative for U.S. China Dialogue on Global Issues at Georgetown University, and Yawei, director, Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University. We're going to begin first with Michael, and I invite you to take the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, Gordon. It's a pleasure to be here. Good to see so many old friends. Good to see Dennis in particular. Haven't seen him in a while. And unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to give you a lot of good news. I certainly sympathize with the views that have been expressed by Minister Jing and by Susan about the hope for greater positive engagement and diplomacy in the relationship, but I'm not terribly optimistic about that happening. I think the U.S.-China relationship displays a lot of the elements of the kind of forces that have led to great power conflict in the past. I think we know what these are, but I'll just tick them off as I see them. There's a deepening power-based ideological and political rivalry going on, with each power viewing the other as an existential or a near existential threat to the other. They're locked in a kind of interactive worst case set of containment and deterrence actions that are deepening over time as I see it. This is inflated by a kind of simplistic, seductive narratives on each side about each side's unmovable zero-sum intentions. You see this resonating on the Hill in various legislation. You see it in certain statements being made by Chinese officials about the United States. And all this is accentuated by domestic political problems in both countries that create enduring insecurities and resentments, I think, that are used by opportunistic politicians to rally support for a variety of so-called patriotic, political, economic, and other policies. And involved in all this are really the sort of assertion of vital interests that need to be defended, keyed to political order, regime stability, or global influence. For China, it's sovereignty issues, territorial integrity, nationalist credentials vis-a-vis Taiwan. For the United States, it's great power, credibility, its image and status as a continued strong, influential power in the world. All of these things play a role in how the two countries view and interact with each other. And to top it all off, you have the absence of clear interest groups on either side that would be in support of a really strong relationship. And the sense of unpredictability that seems to be infusing so many of the observers on both sides, that's sort of accentuated by this kind of post-truth, fact-free forms of argumentation that go on and policy debate with all kinds of weird conspiracy theories and assertions being made about all kinds of issues relating to the relationship. So it's a kind of perfect storm of sorts, with a growing sense that conflict is almost inevitable. There's now in the US endless op-eds appearing in the US media about how to defeat China in a war. And I'm sure the same is going on behind the scenes in China as well. To make matters even worse, under recent developments, we've seen things that I think don't really give us much cause for positive assessments of the situation. Although I take Susan's points about the national security strategy offering some glimmers of hope, I think that both the NSS and the NDS that's recently come out have just reaffirmed the centrality of intensifying great power competition and a kind of zero-sum struggle over political systems, the democracy versus authoritarianism, with some minor caveats. There's some boilerplate comments about avoiding competition becoming aggressive, and needing to cooperate on common threats like climate change, etc. And I hope these really have some meaning within the administration, but I don't see a whole lot there in terms of concrete initiatives and ideas, specific policy suggestions that could be used as a basis for negotiations, serious negotiations between the two sides. Instead, what we get is the passage of U.S. laws specifically designed to prevent China from becoming a fully modern high-tech nation. It's not just about competing, it's also about undermining China's ability to develop in certain ways as a modern high-tech nation. And statements by at least one U.S. defense official now regarding Taiwan as a strategic asset for the United States, and legislation being proposed in certain parts of the Congress that reinforces that image and sees Taiwan as critical to the defense of the United States, not just the Western Pacific, but Guam and Hawaii. I mean, a concept that, if it's adopted as a basis for a U.S. policy, would of course bring the end of the one China policy and put us firmly on the road to conflict. So I don't see a lot of effort going on the U.S. side to try to alter this kind of dynamic, to assert real leadership, to explain to the American people and the Hill and others why this relationship is so important, why it is that we need to have a clear understanding about our relationship long-term, and what that understanding should be from the U.S. perspective. Instead, we get emphasis on aligning with partners and allies to create a more effective, basically counter-China position, and to do so from a position of strength, calling China into account, etc., doubling down on the usual deterrence messaging. As I say, no effort to define what a constructive form of engagement would look like. Even Mike Green, no great fan of China, sees the shortcomings of this approach and the degree to which it is out of step with the desires of many Asian countries. Now, after beating up on the United States, I mean, I would equally do so with China. China is also showing in its behavior, I think, an inability to really come to grips with this worsening dynamic that's going on. The speeches by Xi Jinping and the other activities that we've seen, 20th Party Congress, simply show to me that there's a doubling down of this kind of Leninist nationalist approach to governance, with an emphasis on the state side of the economy, leaning more towards ideology, leaning more towards party control, qualifying peace and development, and the idea of a strategic opportunity for China. These concepts that have undergirded Chinese policy for decades are now being qualified, if not eroded. And they're joined by a much stronger stressing China on defending China's rights, ensuring its security against growing threats posed by the U.S. All are reflected in continued high rates of investment in PLA modernization and China's own version of what it looks upon as being pushback against the U.S. that has created in various areas, all of this, increasing alienation among European nations. And China's negative image in the West is now accentuated by its stance toward the Ukraine war and its continued domestic repression of Uyghurs and others, its stress on surveillance capabilities, its enhanced efforts to define an alternate to liberal democracy around the world. All of this reinforcing this kind of zero-sum dynamic that's going on. And of course, both countries facing domestic problems and challenges. And in the US, along with the prospect of Republicans becoming a majority in the Congress and possibly taking over the presidency, in their view, almost without exception towards China, is much more zero-sum, much more deeply competitive than we've seen thus far. Now, what do we do about this, looking towards the future? I think that with no visible stabilization of the Sino-US relationship, with continued economic problems in both the US and China, and with the possibility of a Republican-led government in 2 years, all this could create a near disastrous situation, particularly regarding Taiwan, which concerns me the most. I think there is an effort to try to redefine U.S. policy regarding Taiwan. There is an effort to have greater strategic clarity, to undermine those basic foundations of U.S. policy towards Taiwan that we have had working for decades that have been effective. I think the Chinese are also taking actions which are throwing into doubt whether or not there's a commitment to peaceful unification over time. I have seen no clear, unambiguous rejection at the most senior levels of the Chinese leadership of a timeline, and no clear rejection at the most senior levels of the Chinese leadership that Chinese rejuvenation by 2049 will have to see Taiwan reunited with China by that date. None of this has been clearly rejected by the Chinese government. So this poses certain questions for me, and I'll end here. Will a stronger Xi Jinping coming out of the 20th Party Congress feel more confident, show greater flexibility in dealing with the US and the West and dealing with domestic problems, or will he just double down on what I regard as Leninist nationalism and the defense of Chinese rights and an expanded definition of security? And by the same token, will US political leaders seek to play on US public support for negotiating our differences with China to develop a genuine strategy of balance, deterrence, and restraint, or simply play the China threat card endlessly in a replay of the Cold War or even worse? In other words, will the US and China actually begin a genuine dialogue that really does discuss where they want to be 20 years from now, 25 years from now, and how they're going to deal with the differences between them, where they're going to make mutual compromises and accommodations? None of that kind of discussion is going on in the United States, as far as I can tell. So I think it needs to happen, and I certainly hope it does happen. And I hope it doesn't rely upon a sort of galvanizing event, such as a crisis, a serious crisis over Taiwan, to clarify people's minds about the kind of situation that we're slipping into and get them to become more focused on not inevitable war or preparing for it, but how to build a durable basis for what I would call constructive engagement, to use an old word that has nonetheless popped up again in some circles in the US government. I think we need to grasp on that and really talk about what that means and engage the Chinese. And the Chinese need to do the same thing and stop their own posturing and their own use of these usual bromides, win-win outcomes, et cetera, that really do not reflect the reality of the kind of situation we're in today. Now, I'm hopeful, as are others, that US diplomacy and Chinese diplomacy will come to the rescue here, and we will see some really significant change for the better in the Sino-US relationship. But right now, I must say I'm not an entirely optimistic person in terms of this kind of situation, and I'll just end there. Thank you.
Very much, Michael. Just before I turn to Huang Jing in Shanghai, we will be watching the Q&A function. Pose questions. We're going to wait until the end, and we may not have time to get to all the questions, but we welcome those questions to be posed. Huang Jing, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, thank you for inviting me here. I'm so glad to see so many good friends, old friends, which we haven't seen each other largely because of this pandemic. Michael's remark, I would say, make my job a little bit easier, because I agree with him absolutely that this bilateral relationship is not very good, and I'm very pessimistic about the foreseeable future in the US-China relationship. For the time's sake, I'll only make a few quick points to highlight where I stand on this issue. First, I would say that this so-called US-China competition is actually a facade. Beneath it, the real challenge, the most formidable challenge for both the United States and China comes from within. In other words, for Xi Jinping or for Biden, the worst problem, the most serious problem is all in their own country, not on the other side. But this competition, I would argue that, it's in a big favor to hardliners on both sides. Hardliners on both sides can use this so-called competition to lash out the problem which should be handled, should be managed, should be solved by the internal effort. But now they can blame others easily, which in turn, provoked this kind of patriotism, whatever you call it, or nationalistic resentment against each other, which makes the situation even worse and even more difficult to manage. And that's my first point. The second point is that this leads us to my second point, that is the political uncertainty of the United States, I would argue, is actually a major problem, a major obstacle for the bilateral relationship to be improved or to return to a normal side. Of course, China also have political uncertainty, but this just finished Party Congress. For whatever result, they can argue that it is worse, it is bad, or it is more centralization of power and so on, of course. It's not the kind of way of life American people want to see, but at least it is more stable, predictable, and it guarantees a policy consistency. Doesn't matter what policy it is, but it is consistent, which is good because it gives you stability. But it is on the other side of the United States, just like Michael said, we're going to have a midterm election, which the majority enjoyed by Democrats will be overthrown, and we're going to have more uncertainty. And in addition to that, if you look at the US policy towards China or towards the entire outside world, it is more and more emotional, more and more irrational emotion. I simply cannot imagine, as my understanding of US national interests, the United States would, for example, would take Russia and China at the same time. The United States would, establish AUKUS, a kind of alliance within an alliance, which is very counterproductive. But anyway, I'll stop here. I'll just argue that this is my second point. Political uncertainty is a major problem for us to overcome if we really want to improve the bilateral relationship. My third point is just kind of add up to what Michael said about Taiwan issue. Let's be frank with each other. There are fundamental differences between China's One China principle and America's One China policy ever since 1979. But the good news is that both sides choose to ignore those fundamental differences or pretend they're non-existent. This has provided both sides with enough maneuvering room in the past 30 years to maintain the so-called status quo. That is the foundation for America's strategic ambiguity. But since Donald Trump, and now very disappointed to me, that even Biden administration, some old hand who understand the issue perfectly, try to so-called clarify this ambiguity, try to highlight the differences between One China principle and the One China policy, which in turn has actually killed all the maneuvering room in the Taiwan issue. Unfortunately, equally to be blamed. And China side also have the same people try to clarify what One China principle really is, why One China principle is not, and by no means should be, One China policy. And that way, we have less and less room or gray area to maneuver. Then the result, of course, is have no choice but to clash against each other, which is very dangerous. That's where I say the problem is. So whenever I say some people argue we should have strategic clarity instead of strategic ambiguity on the Taiwan issue, my heart drops like a stone. And that's my third point. My fourth point is actually good news. We see this Ukraine-Russia conflict, or whatever we call it, is not a war between Russia and Ukraine. Just like Sergei Garganov just said in his long article, of course, we may not agree with what he said, but in his long articles published on September 1st, he made it very clear. This is not a war against Ukraine. This is Russia's onslaught against the so-called American, US-led West international system. He wants to do damage to the system. This put China in a very awkward position. Actually, China had to answer three fundamental questions. Number one, Does China still want to maintain or want to stay in the existing international system in which United States plays a fundamental role? Of course, China is also plays a very important role. Number two, of course, if China want to maintain, want to stay in this international system, a so-called quick decline or decline of the United States, as some people on this side wishes, is decline of the United States really serve China's best interests or China's interests in general? And number three, of course, does China really want to maintain a stable or at least manageable and workable relationship with the United States? From what I read, I understand of the political report of 20th Party Congress, I think Chinese leadership, no matter how you blame it, Chinese leadership has made a choice. Number one, China does want to stay in this international system, even though China may have a little bit different understanding of what this international system is. But China want to stay with it, and China want to even reinforce it. Some will argue that China is a revisionist power, but trust me, revisionist power is much better than, much more desirable than a revolutionary power. And second, of course, China wants United States to maintain stable and prosperous. The reason is this: a stable and united States, really united United States is a good news for bilateral relationship. The more unstable, the more problematic, the more chaotic United States is more dangerous, not only for China, but for the entire world, including the United States itself. Of course, if China want to stay in this international system, China want United States to stay stable, united, and prosperous. Of course, China want to have a stable bilateral relationship with the United States. After all, China is a rising power, just like a teenager. It's still growing. At this moment, of course, a chaotic, even hostile world is the last thing China wants. After all, China is a #1 trading power. A trading power, of course, wants a peaceful, stable, prosperous world. Otherwise, who and where China going to do is trade? So I just stop here. And the last, last one, just some suggestions, because we all pretend we have some good suggestions to the decision makers, even though they will never listen to us. My suggestion is simple. Number one, I think the two countries, two leaderships, if they really want to do something, start to work out a not-to-do list. That is, between the United States and China, what we are not going to do no matter what. Not-to-do list. Work on this first. I may sound a little bit naive, but I truly believe that's where we should start to improve this relationship. And based on this not-to-do list, maybe we can begin to discuss what we need and what we should do to maintain at least, as I said just before, a workable relationship between two largest countries on earth. I'll just stop here.
Thank you very much, Wang Jiang. I now literally turn to my left to Dennis Welter, who's here beside me. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you to ICAS for inviting me this morning to this very important discussion. Let me start at perhaps the 30,000-foot level and say that in my many decades in the U.S. government, particularly in the intelligence community, we often talked about the tectonic plates of history moving in various ways. But I think today we actually are seeing the tectonic plates move, and in a way that will shape the 21st century. The global order organized by the United States is under pressure. It's under stress. There is no question about it. It was a global order started at the end of World War II, but the severe challenges are coming from the major powers, certainly from Russia, to some degree from China, and lesser players like North Korea and Iran. On the Chinese side, the challenge economically and militarily is very credible. China is now the largest trading partner with 68 countries in the world. China has the second largest defense budget after the United States, and China now has the largest Navy in the world. These are fundamental changes. And I'm afraid to say, and I'm sure some of my colleagues will disagree with me, but the position China has taken in relationship to Russia only adds to this feeling in the United States of the challenge. The Chinese government has been very quiet on the aggression, the needless aggression of the Russians. We have not seen the Chinese government, for example, come out directly against Putin's talk of using nuclear weapons in this struggle. I was heartened to see the other day in the Financial Times that my old friend, Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, actually came out with an article warning the Russians against the use of nuclear weapons, but he is merely an academic. He's not speaking for the Chinese government. I think the Chinese government needs to take a much more proactive stance on trying to find a way to peace in this conflict. China has the relationship with Russia that we don't currently have. And I think that this is an important moment for China to stand up and show if, as Professor Huang Jin has said, China wants the international order to remain and wants to be part of that international order, then it needs to speak up on issues like the Ukraine in a more positive way. So because of these geostrategic realities, Biden and his administration are definitely seeing China as a fixture on the global landscape where competition is going to be a big part of the future. And I don't see anything that changes that assessment. You all know what's in the national security strategy. And I'll quote from it, the PRC is the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to advance that objective. These views are shared across the political spectrum in the United States and indeed more generally in the public. The Pew poll of this summer showed 66% of Americans saw China as a major military threat. So in this context, I don't think it's surprising that we are seeing from the Biden administration such steps as the targeted decoupling of the semiconductor industry. There was a very good article in the Washington Post recently about this issue, where it showed that Chinese companies have purchased these semiconductors and other advanced technologies to build hypersonic missiles. I don't think the Chinese government would allow its companies to sell things to the United States that would advance the military capabilities of China. So I do think that this is understandable. I think it is targeted decoupling. I think there may be other areas of advanced technology the Biden administration will move ahead on with some sanctions. But I don't think that the administration is actually thinking of a complete decoupling of the economic relationship. After all, as the minister said this morning, $750 billion of trade is not inconsequential, and many American companies have very real vested interest in China that aren't going to change. I think the other thing China has to think about is the dark view of the future that President Xi outlined at the 20-party Congress. He downplayed the era of strategic opportunity and spoke of China embracing the need to struggle in the face of hostile forces. This kind of rhetoric, this kind of language just adds again in Washington to a feeling that China is going to challenge the American led order in the world. So with all this background, where are U.S.-China relations going? Well, I have to say, nowhere good at the moment. I have to agree with my colleagues that I'm pessimistic. China cut off 8 of the high-level exchanges, important exchanges with the United States after the Pelosi visit to Taiwan. Ambassador Nick Burns only got to speak to the Chinese foreign minister 8 months after his arrival in Beijing. And as somebody noted, it's been 3 years since U.S. cabinet secretaries or members of Congress have been to Beijing. The good news is that both sides explicitly state that they don't want a war. And certainly Washington has its hands full with the Ukrainian crisis at the moment. But the truth is that history tells us, and Susan Thornton referred to it this morning, that wars are often the result of miscalculation and misunderstanding. I remember the EP3 crisis of 2001. I was the director of China analysis at the CIA at the time. And when that occurred on April 1st, 2001, it was a scary moment. I can tell you that President Bush's instincts at that moment were to strike back, were to be very angry. And my colleagues and I had to tell him that that wasn't the best approach, that the best approach was to allow quiet diplomacy to occur. Happily, the president listened to us, allowed our ambassador in Beijing to work these things through, and 10 days later, the crew was released, the aircraft was returned to the United States, and the issue was solved. But I have to ask everyone, what would happen today if we had a similar misunderstanding, a similar dreadful incident somewhere in the East China Sea, South China Sea? I shudder to think what the hyperbole would be on both sides. And it's why, as has been said already by many here, I hope that dialogue can be achieved. I hope that we can find a way to reinvigorate the U.S. China dialogues. Dialogue is not a dirty word. Engagement is not a dirty word. These are important. We need those confidence building measures. They have atrophied. And I hope, and I was very heartened to see that President Xi Jinping sent a message to the National Committee's gala in New York, saying that he was looking for the right path in U.S.-China relations. I hope that right path can be found, but I think it's going to be a rough time getting there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis. And we will now turn to our fourth speakers, Dao Wei in Beijing. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Gordon, and thank ICAS for inviting me for this wonderful panel. I think of course, I basically agree with all the opinions that has been expressed by other panelists, and I think we all share this kind of pessimism regarding China-U.S. relations. I think it's very, very hard to find anyone who is very optimistic about the U.S.-China relations in DC and in Beijing. But I will try to say something about the latest development in Beijing and in DC, the working paper of the Party Congress and the National Security Strategy and midterm. I think the latest development and the next year, because the theme of this panel is about next year. So I will say, yeah, I agree that the mainstream, the basic trajectory is pessimistic, but I will say I don't see any major policy changes from the Party Congress and from the other midterm election or the national security strategy of the US. I see more continuity from these two documents. I see more continuities, at least from last year, this year. Of course, compared with 10 years ago, dramatic change. But I mean, in the short term, I think I see continuity rather than changes. On China side, I think China, in the working paper of the Party Congress, I think the CPC do have a grim assessment of the international environment. We can see some expression disappeared, like period of strategic opportunity, or the peace and development as the theme of the time. This kind of old consistent assessment disappeared this time. But I will say in the chapters regarding the job next step, I see no new expression, no new discourse, no new policy in the chapter of the foreign policy, chapter of one country, two system, chapter of the military buildup, and even the chapter of the national security. I think all those discourse are old, so that implies a kind of continuity. And as Professor Wu Shicun pointed out at the beginning of this discussion, China, of course, has a new leadership in Beijing. I will say China's foreign policy is mainly dictated by the president, by the supreme leader himself. And with President Xi continue his third term, I will say that implies that probably the policy will continue rather than change. So it's really hard to imagine, China's foreign policy or policy towards the U.S. will have a major change after the 20th Party Congress. And I think after reading the national security strategy of the U.S. side, my impression is the U.S. side from basically from the Obama administration to Trump administration, then now Biden administration. I think the three administrations from the two parties, they try to shift the U.S. national security focus from counterterrorism from the Middle East to Asia, to China, and now this transition, of course, finished or accomplished. And in the U.S., we are witnessing more matured, more sustainable strategic competition strategy towards China. And I see this in this latest national security strategy. And there is a bipartisan support to this strategy. And also, I think it's a strategy across the executive branch and the legislative branch. That means this strategy will continue for a very long time. So, of course, it's not new. It starts from, at least from Trump administration, and now the Biden administration continue this and with slightly different, using the term like out-competing China, and give some strategic reassurance signals to China, like mention the coexistence with China, and also reiterate the U.S. One China policy in the paper. I think in the strategy, I think those are strategic reassurance signals to China. So we don't have any naive expectation to the U.S. strategy to China, but I think now it's stable. It's a long-term thing. So if Beijing and Washington continue current trajectory next year, and given the fact there will be no major domestic political agenda next year, can we, maybe we can expect next year as a year that we try to stabilize this competition. I'm not saying end the competition or change the competition back to engagement. I have no that kind of expectation, of course, but maybe we have a chance to stabilize our bilateral, stabilize our strategic competition, and to enter a phase of maybe stable competition in next year. If we don't do that next year, I agree with Michael that 2 years later, we may see more dangerous period in the bilateral relations because of the US domestic political agenda. This is my first point I want to say. The second point I want to say is I see three quite interesting, or to some extent dangerous views or changes in the U.S. in the U.S. regarding China. I think one is viewing China through the lens of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and viewing China just as Russia. Identify the two countries together, bind them together, or view Taiwan issue from the lens of Ukraine. I think that I have seen this happen in the U.S. So of course, as Dennis pointed out, China's position, I know that China's position was blamed a lot in the U.S. and I understand why China is blamed. But I also want to point it out that before the Ukraine war, the U.S. already pointed China as revisionist. The U.S. believe China is a revisionist country from Trump administration rather than from China's behavior, China's policy in Ukraine war. So, in this regard, I think China also on this issue exaggerates China's differences with the U.S. on international order. I agree with Professor Huang. I think China do want to stay in the system, but I think internally we exaggerate China's differences with the U.S. on what is the order and who define the order and what is the content of the order. The second new view in the U.S. is believing China's rise has reached its peak. I think this new assumption will change a lot change many policies in the U.S. because the U.S. used to believe that China surpass the U.S. economic size will be inevitable. But now I think many people in the U.S., at least in D.C., believe China's rise has peaked. And if so, that could bring some new elements to the U.S.-China policy. The third one is, I think Michael mentioned this, many in the U.S. believe China is defeatable. China is a nuclear power like Russia, and I think mainstream view was that the U.S. should not fight a war with that kind of country, nuclear power, and that kind of conflict, no one can win that conflict. But from the because of the bad behavior of Russia, I mean, because of failure of the Russian in Ukraine, many in the U.S. believe if Russia can be defeated, maybe China can be defeated too. That will be very, very dangerous. And I think it explains some new initiative and policies regarding Taiwan, try to help Taiwan together with the U.S. defeat China. I think that's quite dangerous change. My last point would be several very humble suggestions for next year, not for 2024, but for 2023. I think it echoes with what Susan and Minister Jingquan's what they said. First of all, of course, to resume our official dialogue. If we can have a presidential dialogue in G20, that will be, of course, good news. I hope next year we can see more. Second, I think, of course, to resume our people-to-people exchanges, particularly academic exchanges. I think Susan mentioned there are many fears, and if we have chance to visit each other's capital, if we have the chance to talk to our friends and colleagues in person, I think many fear will disappear. I think we exaggerate each other's level of their harshness of the policy. If you travel to Beijing, you can see there are many different opinions among Chinese, and if you travel to DC, I think there are similar things. The third point, nobody mentioned this, but I think it's important. I understand that the U.S. are pursuing a policy of small yard and high fence. It's okay. I'm quite okay with that. Every country have its yard, but I think the two countries need to work together to try to make the fence of that yard stable. I mean, we cannot move the fence every year or several months. You move the fence again. That will create chaos in business community. Not only in China, it will create difficulties in the US and in other countries and the regions. So if US want to build a yard, okay, but I think we need to negotiate where is the boundary. Where is the boundary of the yard? I think that's important. The last is of course Taiwan. Actually, that's not a suggestion. I do have serious concern over Taiwan, but next year I think at least we need to prevent Taiwan issue to have very strong impact again after the midterm election. I don't know what the Republican-controlled Congress will do, but probably McCarthy already said he will lead a delegation to Taiwan. If that happens, maybe something like August will repeat. I have very strong concern over that. I think both China and the U.S. are not satisfied with what happened in August. Both sides think they should do more. China may think we need to do more to deter the U.S. The U.S. may believe that they need to do more to challenge China or to support Taiwan. So if we both sides believe so, we are probably waiting for next crisis. That will be extremely dangerous. So we have to do something at least to try to prevent Taiwan issue have strong impact in next year to those recovery of the official and the civil people-to-people exchanges. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yawei. I think we have a lot of grist for our mill, and I think we could probably finish our time with debate amongst the speakers. But I would like to give an opportunity to our broader audience who have posed several questions. I'm not sure that we need 4 responses to every question, but I'll start off with one. I think I might direct this to my near neighbor, Dennis. How should the international community view the recent Chinese hypersonic missile testing? To what extent should it be taken into consideration for U.S. nuclear policies?
Well, I think it was a shock to the U.S. military, to the U.S. defense establishment more broadly, that China was out ahead of the United States in this particular area of advanced capability. The U.S. side, my understanding, had been working on such systems, but had not achieved the degree of success that was seen by China in these tests. I think it adds to this concern in Washington. It adds to the level of concern that China, again, is advancing in ways that could threaten the international order. This is why I think it's so important that we get back to the military-to-military dialogues that have been suspended at this point. I think sometimes that China thinks that these dialogues are designed by the United States to try and get China's secrets, military secrets. I would hope the Chinese side can begin to see that these are necessary confidence building measures. Dr. SWAINE has been involved for years in trying to build confidence building on both sides in the military-to-military sphere. And I think it's important, but I do remember that we in the Bush administration tried to get a strategic dialogue going with the Chinese strategic rocket forces, and frankly found it very difficult to get the Chinese side to agree to meetings. And so I think in the strategic realm, we really need some serious dialogues on the future. China's building a lot more missiles. We need to understand China's strategic doctrine. They need to understand our strategic doctrine.
Are there other comments from our other panelists on that specific question? Or I will move to the next. I think we're satisfied with that then. And the next question, with initiatives and agreements such as IPF, TTC, AUKUS, and the BRI in mind, that's a real range of issues. What role can and should third countries play in the U.S. China strategic competition? Is there a role, one could argue, or is this simply between two houses, Beijing and Washington? Perhaps I might ask Hong Jing, is this something exclusive, this rivalry? as a Canadian, again, I can't stop being a Canadian. Other countries, third countries are affected by that rivalry. But is there a role or something useful could be done by third countries in reacting to or dealing with this, the most important bilateral relationship on earth? Thank you, Mrs.
He needs to unmute himself.
He's muted.
声音，王老师。
There we go.
Yeah, I said my line is not very stable, so I'm not sure I get your question rightly.
I'll just
Could you
quickly
repeat it?
repeat it. The question came from one of the audience members saying there's a whole range of issues, international issues involving China and the United States. I'm paraphrasing here. But this core international question of U.S. China rivalry, is there a role for third countries, how they may be affected? Is there anything that they can do other than sit on the sidelines and watch
Oh, okay.
this play out?
This is very unfortunate because the two countries has totally different positions or desires or wishes on this. United States, of course, want other countries, especially its allies and partners, to absolutely take side with United States, just like this Russia-Ukraine war. But China, of course, China understand it is naive or wishful thinking to ask other countries to side with China because, like some pundits argue, that China does not have any allies. China does not even have good friends. But anyway, China's policy is to, in Xi Jinping's word, is to make partners, but not allies. 结伴不结盟. I think this has some profound thinking in it. If you like, I can explain to you. But so that gives a third country a very difficult, questions. Because United States, the number one power, said, please, you have to side with me. You are siding with the right side of history. Or some political leaders in America even say, either me or him. So that is a kind of position. But China at least pretend, or China want, you just take a neutral side. Don't take side. China said it believes in multilateralism, but at least we know that some political leaders in the United States try to practice unilateralism. Given this kind of completely opposite position of the two involved major powers in this kind of competition, so it's really up to the third world countries to decide what kind of role it can or it should play. I think it takes some guts to really take a position that really works for its national interests. We don't have to look very far, just look at European countries, how difficult that choice could be.
If there aren't other comments, I'm going to pass on to another question. This was actually put to Mr. Wilder. I'm going to put it to Michael to begin with. And certainly, Dennis, if you want to add in, it's coming from an American, anonymous, but let's put yourself in China's position, the possibility of just moved here, of a Donald Trump presidency, it'd be a second presidency, with a finger on the nuclear button. I don't think it's that simple, of course. Should the China not be nervous about this prospect, and what does this mean in terms of the post 2024, potentially post 2024 Trump presidency and the GOP Congress? Quote, it scares the hell out of many in the United States. Why should it not in China and affect their worst case planning? Michael, please, and then Dennis, if you wish.
Sure.
Well, I don't know what the Chinese planning is on if a Trump retakes the presidency. It could very well be that. I mean, Trump has never been terribly supportive of making radical changes in, say, Taiwan policy to sort of endanger or create a more unstable kind of situation. He was not very engaged on that issue. I mean, he was sloppy, he was inattentive in some ways, I think, and he made mistakes on it. But there wasn't this sort of deliberate drive to double down on sort of deterrence efforts. Now, I could be wrong about that. He might indeed adopt that, but I'm more concerned if you have I don't know, a DeSantis in the White House or a Pompeo with what they've already been saying about China, that would be a much more, to me, much more concerning because it would be a more effective, more competent, and more dangerous Trump. And so I think that the Chinese might well hope that Trump is better than the alternatives. But of course, I think if the Democrats are able to hold on to the Congress, which seems unlikely, but if they are, and if they're able to hold on to the presidency, then I think you'll have a more manageable situation as long as the administration sticks to its guns on the question of the one China policy, but lends more credibility to it. It has been eroding the credibility of that policy, in my opinion, and it needs to reverse that in the future. And I think if it is able to establish a stable political position, it will be more inclined to be able to resist some of the more extreme views that exist in the Congress and elsewhere that it has not been really resisting very effectively for, in part, political reasons, in my view. And if that is gone, then you might very well see a more pragmatic approach to dealing with China. And as I say, on the Chinese side, I hope that Yawei and others are right, that the strength of Xi Jinping coming out of the 20th Party Congress will in fact lead him to also become more, in a way, more pragmatic in dealing with some of these most sensitive issues. So there is a possible more optimistic future here, but it's not an optimistic future that's going to be a resumption of a positive, constructive Sino-US relationship. I don't think. We will still have the kind of zero-sum thinking and maneuvering that goes on now under even the best case for both a Biden administration and the Xi Jinping.
That was a partisan question. This is a nonpartisan conference, but could you have a quick reaction to that, please?
I think if I were on the Chinese side looking at the American political system today, I think I would try very hard to take advantage of the next 2 years to build a firewall against whatever comes in the 2024 election.
Right.
So this is a period of time, I think both Yawei and Michael talked about this, that a couple of years from now, it gets worse. It gets more dangerous. If indeed that is true, then it only means we need to double down right now on trying to figure out a stabilizing new normal in the U.S. China relationship.
Right.
I'd like to actually extend that question, if I may, to both of our Chinese speakers. If you could give me, perhaps, starting with Yawei, a quick reaction to that question. What about 2024 and the prospect of a change of administration to a different party in power? You're on mute.
I think it's of course too early to analyze 2024 because we don't know who will be on the ballot. But we talked a lot about Donald Trump's another term. First of all, I personally don't think it's very likely. It's possible, but I don't think it's very likely. And secondly, I will say if it's him, I won't say it's the worst scenario. I agree with I think that's Dennis or Michael. I forget who said this, but I think there are other more dangerous candidates in the Republicans from China's perspective, and on the Democratic side, it's we may be more familiar with the Democratic side, but anyway, no matter which party and who is in the White House, I think this strategic competition is already there and it will be there for quite a long time. So it's just the tactics, the approach. I think those differences. Of course, we want the more predictable candidates, but I don't know who it will be. Yeah, but we don't have a very high expectation to 2024. It could be dangerous, I will say.
Wang Jing, would you care to add a few words?
声音，黄老师，mute。
I think from my point of view, the worst thing about Donald Trump is uncertainty because this person is unpredictable, and he behaved like I don't know how to describe it. If 2024 happened again, I think no matter who's in the White House, what on this side, on China's side, I think the entire world in general worries about is uncertainty. That is, United States is the number one power. As a number one power, you can be good, you can be bad, you can be vicious, whatever, but you have to be predictable. If you laugh to me, smart to me today, continuously smart to me tomorrow. The worst thing is that you're smart to me today and tomorrow you want to kill me, and nobody knows how to deal with you. China is the same story. That's why I think if you compare China and the United States, I think if China is a little bit in advance, ahead of United States nowadays, is China at least is predictable. It's not uncertain. And having said that, frankly, I still have a very strong confidence in both sides system. In a system in which I believe the crazy guy can be stopped. That's where my last hope is and my confidence is.
Thank you. And I'm going to riff a little bit on another question came in on COVID, and we heard from both our keynote speakers, particularly from Susan, concerned about the long-term and lasting effects of this isolationism. We've all been in isolation for, quite frankly, it seems forever now, but there are consequences to this, and the illusion from this questions, there's economic consequences. When can we put this question to our two Chinese speakers? When can we see an ending to this COVID question? And my own take as well is that these tens of millions of visitors who would leave China, expose the outside world, and then return, and sharply higher numbers of students, etc. Over time, you think that this would have, and it did have, a significant effect on Chinese thinking in the broadest sense. But I don't yet see an exit. I know that we've got Dennis Simon there now, and Chinese ambassador in Canada reassured me last week that there's going to be a more targeted approach to this. But I think the world's getting impatient. I miss having a chance to visit China. I think I can speak for the others on this panel and those in the audience. What is your thinking? And I know that this is something core to the core decision for the government. I'm not expecting you to read their minds, but what are your thoughts about this problem and its effects going forward? Perhaps we'll start with Yawei. You could just unmute, please, Yawei.
Yes, thank you. Of course, obviously, I don't have the answer to this question. We have to ask our leader and public health officials. But I will say many people here expect that next year may see some changes in this policy. But I'm not. Of course, I'm not 100% sure. But as you said, I think current situation, current policy hurts. It has consequences, and it hurts economic policy, and it hurts international interactions. So I think the price is very high. So I think given that reason, I believe that next year we will see more changes to current policy, but I don't know. Again, this is not something I can predict. Maybe Professor Huang Jing knows better. I don't know.
That way you put me on the spot. I don't know, because the question I have to ask myself again is the situation we see, the situation we complain about. The topmost leaders must also see and heard about it, unless he's truly stupid and irrational. In other words, he must see the situation from different perspectives. The first thing come to my mind is that China has over 500 million retired senior people. Chinese is retired at 55 years old. And those retired people, all the medical treatment, United States called Medicare, whatever, it's all on the government. And in the United States, every 1,000 people is about 48 doctors registered. But in China, 1.4. So you can, and China's distribution of medical resources extremely uneven. So you can imagine if the COVID come in China like what happened in Hong Kong India, those retired senior citizens go to doctor for free. All they have is time. They'll go to all those hospitals. That's a horrible, horrible situation. I just give one reason. Maybe I think the leaders must balance the pro and the cons and make this decision. Trust me, I don't think it's an easy decision. It's the most difficult situation because they can see what happened in the world. Every country is opened up except China. That makes, you don't want to be isolated. But as this issue, China is isolated. I do not believe that's a good failure. So they must have a reason behind it. But from my point of view, I agree with Yawei. Eventually, they're going to find a way out. And this time, I don't know when, but I think it must be after this winter. And I also believe it will be like, a test. Chinese leaders love to do the test, like Shenzhen. They're going to test like a little bubble here, a little bubble there, and gradually, they're going to find a way out. But it's not an easy journey, given what's happening in China, given what's at the stake for the Chinese leadership.
Thank you, Wang. You confirm my suspicion that it's more complicated than what might think at first glance. Next question, I'm two American panelists, and it deals with the Indo-Pacific region, noting that in the questioner's viewpoint, the Biden administration has sought to intensify U.S. focus on the Indo-Pacific region and seeks to achieve through both security and economic cooperation, highlighting its strategy through the economic framework, the Indo-Pacific economic framework. Can you please, we don't have a tremendous amount of time, but we've got a few minutes, clarify these strategies and their purposes. I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel here, but perhaps starting with you, Dennis, what is the U.S. about and what does it mean? I'm thinking particularly for let's think of U.S.-China relations.
Well, I think that Secretary Blinken, when he has talked about American strategy, has laid an emphasis on the fact that we want to bolster the alliances in East Asia that we have. That from the American point of view, these have served the United States very well. The bumper sticker is a free and open Indo-Pacific with free trade, free navigation. And I think that in that regard, the Biden administration has decided it wants to redouble those efforts. So you do see such things as AUKUS being developed. You see the Quad being developed more. All of these things the United States believes helps it keep peace and security in East Asia. Beijing has a different point of view. But I think from the American point of view, the alliances have been incredibly important. And I would just point out with the North Koreans, how much we rely on the alliance relationships to deal with that issue. And I must say the North Koreans are being extremely belligerent at this point. This is another area, by the way, where China could help. If China could get the North Koreans back to the peace talks, because the United States has indicated a full willingness to go back to peace talks with the North Koreans, and we're getting no response from the North Koreans on this. Instead, we're getting missile launches and other activities, and potentially more nuclear tests in North Korea. So the alliance relationships are, I think, a centerpiece of U.S. policy in East Asia and isn't going to change anytime soon. Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Dennis has said. There's not going to likely be any changes. I guess if I were to characterize the U.S. strategy, it still is relying very heavily on the idea that the United States needs to get its allies and partners in the region on the same page with itself in countering China. I mean, U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy is centrally about balancing against China. And the efforts that the United States has been taking in that regard are very much about how to relate to other countries in the region other than China in developing this kind of a counterforce against China. And if I had to criticize the strategy, I would say that it really does lack an understandable strategy for actually engaging the Chinese in the security realm. It's more about limiting, shaping, countering than it is about actually engaging on security issues that are really, really critical. And you can see this in the documents, the National Defense Strategy. You know, I went online the other day to look at the summary fact sheet on the White House about the Indo-Pacific strategy. They issue these summary fact sheets about what it is. And it's like a 2-page summary of what the strategy is. It doesn't even mention China. It just talks about what we need to do to double down to get everybody to be in the US camp on this. And in the defense area, it's very much oriented towards creating interoperability, integrating other countries into the US defense perimeter. And, you know, I think that is how do you square that undertaking, first of all, with allied views? And there are many allies, many concerns among allies about how far that would go and what the impact would be in their relations with Beijing. And of course, it also doesn't really address the question about what China's response would likely be. And there, I think, you just don't have enough thought being given to the interactive dynamic that is going on here between the US and China that really makes this situation more unmanageable over time. There has to be, at some point, a turn away from building up the alliances to counter China to an effective strategy that really deals with how to engage China, including in the security realm. And as I've said before, we haven't really seen that yet.
Thank you. I just got a note from Dennis Simon in Beijing who said that Chinese media reported today there's been a working group formed to look at how to emerge from the COVID restrictions. A group formation doesn't mean lifting, it's a start. I'd like to use our last few minutes, gentlemen, to ask the speakers to perhaps pose a question to another of the speakers on the basis of some of the things that they've asked or that you have a curiosity. I could ask for a volunteer from one of you four to pose that first question, and perhaps the other three to have a question in mind. The answers will have to be of that 2-minute variety. So short question, relatively brief answer.
Gosh.
I think I see Wang Jing.
I have a question to either Dennis or Michael, either of you. And I was in Europe last month. When I was there, I know that a lot of my European friends were confused by President Biden's article on May 31st in New York Times, in which he drew 4 red lines. And as I was told, there's no consultation between American leadership and the European leadership before President Biden publishes articles. That's why they get very confused. They don't know what exactly the purpose of this war. Fundamentally, at the end of it, what the United States really want out of this war. Given the fact that Russians did invade Ukraine, that's my view. The invasion aggression is a fact.
Dennis, you should take
remind
that.
us?
Well, I guess Wang Jing, May is 6 months ago.
Yeah.
Could you just give us like a sentence reminder of the contents?
Okay. President Biden said 4 no's. Number 1, no direct involvement of NATO. Absolutely. Number 2, no regime change in Russia, which, went back on his own words. Number 3, no attack, no US attack of Russia unless United States is attacked, and no American boots will be on the Ukraine territory. Number 4, which is quite controversial. Number 4 is that the United States and NATO will not enable Ukraine to attack Russian territory. That's 4 no's.
We're going to do a different.
May 31st, New York Times.
I'm happy to.
Please. Dennis.
I think that the purpose of such an article is to limit this war.
Yeah.
We don't, on the American side, certainly want to see this develop into a broader NATO and Russia conflict. We don't want to see the Ukrainians broadening this into Russian territory in any way, shape, or form. So I think that the signaling the Biden administration was trying to do there was to delimit this situation, keep it controlled, keep it within the boundaries of the conflict as it exists today. I think that that on the American side, the feeling is that we have to do all we can short of American troops on the ground to assist the Ukrainians. Certainly now that the Russians now have seemingly a new ally in the Iranians who are providing drones to Russia that are devastating the power infrastructure in Ukraine, that it's all the more important that we continue to keep NATO together, that we keep our allies on board, and that we show restraint, whereas I'm not sure the Russians are showing much restraint at this point.
We have a few minutes only, and I'm determined to land this more or less on time and pass it on to
There's a few more questions for the meeting.
a few more questions.
Can I raise one more question?
Please go ahead, Yawei.
Yes. Yeah, we talk about the U.S. position to Russia. U.S. won't fight a war with Russian in Ukraine, but there are so many discussions in U.S. about strategic clarity on Taiwan issue. So my friends in PLA are very puzzled why the U.S. want to fight a war with China over Taiwan while won't fight a war with Russia over Ukraine. Does that mean the U.S. look down PLA? Do you believe PLA is weaker than the Russian military force, or what other explanation?
Happy to.
Well,
Michael and then Dennis, please.
yeah, I think this reflects the very vast differences that there are between the Ukraine situation and the Taiwan situation, which I think the Chinese need to understand. I mean, they themselves are saying that there's huge differences there. And clearly, the United States has had a long-standing, deeply rooted commitment to the peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue. And it is obligated by law to maintain Taiwan's defense capabilities and to maintain the U.S. Capabilities as well. So it is much more deeply rooted in American policy and in some ways in American interests. And so it does raise, obviously, and China's capabilities to be able to employ force against Taiwan have, without doubt, increased exponentially over the decades. So it's not a surprise at all that some people would say, oh, the only solution to this is for the United States to really declare that it's going to defend Taiwan because this is a really critical interest for the United States. It relates to American credibility, et cetera, et cetera. And you have many, many articles now that are appearing all over the place, like mushrooms, about how the United States needs to double down on deterrence and build up its strengths and really show the Chinese that there is no option to use of force. Now, the problem with all of that is that these articles, almost without exception, fail to address the reassurance side of that equation. Effective deterrence regarding the Taiwan issue cannot occur without some level of credible reassurance towards the Chinese about what U.S. military capabilities will be used to do. And so you have a real danger there that you could get a misinterpretation or you could get an overreaction that could lead to direct conflict. And so the danger of direct Sino-U.S. conflict over Taiwan is much greater than the danger of direct Russian-U.S. conflict over Ukraine, in my opinion, for the reasons that I've just given, that I think the Chinese are very aware of.
I would only add, I agree with everything Michael has said. I think that the Biden administration has underperformed on reassurance in relation to the Taiwan issue. Right. I think they they've gone way overboard on thinking about the military side of this equation and not thinking enough about the diplomatic side. Someone this morning mentioned Mao and Nixon and the ability of the two to overcome tremendous differences of opinion. I think that's where we need to go. We need to have diplomats like Zhou Enlai and Kissinger. And certainly a big part of this is the American side needs to make sure that Beijing is reassured that we aren't on the road to an independent Taiwan.
Here, here. Totally agree with Dennis.
Thank you for that. Now we have two questions, right? With Hong Nong's permission, I'm going to go just a few minutes over time. I have one question which we're going to put to our two Chinese participants, and it comes from the China correspondent from the Financial Times. And that is, do you think that Beijing will retaliate over the October 7th export controls? Perhaps starting with Yawei and then to Hongjing. Brief answers, and then our last question will be to our two Americans.
I have not heard any specific discussion to that export control measures, and I don't think it will happen. I don't think something will happen aiming at retaliating that specific cheap exportation control measures. But I do heard a lot of discussion in Beijing about how can we deal with more generally the U.S. this kind of decoupling measures, or how should we deal with the U.S. sanctions? Generally speaking, U.S. sanctions over Chinese company. So we have a counter-sanction law in China. So how it can be implemented? I think these are the questions that I heard in Beijing, but nothing about that specific decision on October 7th.
Yeah, I agree with Dawei. I do know that there are some extreme opinions said retaliation, but thank God the cool head prevailed eventually, because for two reasons. Reason number one, as a stronger party, that is United States, make actions. The weaker parties are China, if react according to Americans' actions, that we get into or be entrapped into Americans' kind of a framework, which of course being led into a struggle is never a smart choice. Mao Zedong said that 你打你的，我打我的. That is, you do what you want, I do what good for me. So I think Chinese leaders have this kind of wisdom. They're not going to be led into the trap. Secondly, that of course, if there's the act react continuously, and then we're all going to get in the vicious cycle. I think on this part, frankly, I think Chinese leadership does have more wisdom on this, not get into the vicious cycle, because this kind of control, October 7th control, my personal opinion, is even anti-constitution, because in the constitution we see that the pursuance of happiness is all right. But now if you're Americans or you have American green card, you're not even allowed to do certain kind of job. What kind of Americanism that is?
My last question, it doesn't deal directly with, it's not from me, it's from Phil Calvert. Doesn't directly deal with U.S. China relations, but it certainly deals with our broad theme, the panel of U.S. China Strategic Rivalry. It goes right back to this question of the Indo-Pacific strategy. Phil Calvert notes that while there are enthusiastic participants, I'm paraphrasing here, Australia, Japan, there are a great number of Southeast Asian countries that really don't want to pick sides. They want good relations with both sides, and they don't want to join. They don't want the pressure to join either a Beijing-led or US-led alliance, strategic alliance or security alliance. Dennis, I wonder if you could tackle that one. What do you do about those countries just say we don't want to play? We don't want to be on in either camp.
I think there are a lot of countries in ASEAN, but I think there are a lot of countries around the world who are trying to figure out how to balance between Beijing and Washington. I think this is putting people in very awkward positions. I'm not sure how these countries, I think each one will have to figure out their own way to deal with the tensions. I think that the key here is that I think we all do want free and open trade. And I think that is terribly important to all these nations. So as long as the international system still operates on what Susan Thornton was talking about in terms of keeping the rules of the road in free and open trade, these countries will be reassured somewhat. But if we end up with true decoupling of the U.S. and China economy, that is going to have ripple effects all around the world.
Thank you, Dennis, for that high altitude view of the issue. Last word to Michael, please.
Well, just one point I agree entirely with what Dennis just said. I think these countries have to really develop a way in which to deal with this, but the U.S. and China are not making it easy. Both sides say they also don't want to force other countries to make choices, but they seem to be doing things that are suggesting otherwise. But I would just say the one caveat to do with other than Southeast Asia, Japan and South Korea. I would not completely assume that Japan and South Korea are in lockstep with the United States on its policy towards China, particularly the South Koreans, but the Japanese as well. Now, Japan has moved a long way toward the U.S. position on China, for sure. And South Korean sentiment has as well in some ways, but there still is a strong core of different, both public opinion and leadership views that are very concerned by where things are going in the Sino-US relationship and are not going to completely sign on to, in their view at least, they don't think that their respective countries should sign on to policies that will lock them into US decisions towards China, particularly in the military realm. And there, I think there is some room for greater voices, not to oppose the alliance with the United States, of course not, but to talk about the need to have some kind of clarity and balance and some sort of real restraint in a variety of areas that are very sensitive for these countries. And Taiwan is probably the most important one there. I don't think the United States should be pushing Japan, for example, to provide in advance clear, unambiguous support for any action that the United States might take in the event of a crisis over Taiwan. I think the Japanese political system would not agree to that overall, and I think it would be pushing for something that I think will create more problems than it will resolve in the case of Japan, and even more so for South Korea.
We are now at the end of our session. We haven't solved the issues. I'd probably argue that for a young analyst, there's probably a lifetime employment security if you want to work on U.S.-China relations, in terms of the issues are never going to go away and they're never going to be finally solved. Dialogue is key. And as Churchill said, jaw is better than war. This has been a significant dialogue. I thank our speakers for their contributions and their wisdom. I apologize for some of the questions. We didn't get to every question. The tyranny of time. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Let me join Gordon thanking all our panelists. We're going to have a very quick 5 minutes break, and so that we can set the stage again. And please stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you.